College football nerds here talking Ole Miss and Georgia. Georgia fans are going to get sick of us. I think this is 3 weeks in a row, and people are maybe getting a little bit sick of us doing SEC games, but to that I will say, have more interesting games outside the SEC, and I think we're getting there as the season goes on. We did a Michigan-Penn State game earlier this week, if you want to check that one out. And I've got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. I want to remind you, collegefootballnerds.com has all the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this video, either relative performance statistics or the model or our power ranking 1 through 133, where we have our model simulate against every team, all 133, against all other teams in the country, and it spits out a ranking based on wins. Josh, in this game, I've heard a lot of people say, well, if Missouri's offense can put Georgia's defense on roller skates a little bit, then what in the world is Ole Miss's offense going to do to Georgia? And I think there's some merit there to that question. But also, I think people need to remember that there's two sides of the football, and Missouri is a better defensive team, and sometimes if you don't play good defense, it can put your offense in a situation where they don't look great.
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides of the football look, right? But, I mean, Ole Miss is 9th in our relative performance metrics as a passing team. They are 42nd in rushing. Missouri is 10th and 75th. They are similar football teams in terms of throwing the football. They are maybe a little worse at Missouri in terms of running it. But to your point, defensively, you know, I think that's where Missouri stayed in it, but I also don't think it's that dissimilar. I mean, Missouri is 24th in terms of passing, 31st in terms of rushing. Ole Miss is 26th in terms of passing, 23rd in terms of rushing. So I would counter that a little bit and say that to a certain degree, Ole Miss really is just a better version of Missouri. In particular, Missouri is a below-average passing attack. Ole Miss is a pretty darn good rushing attack, I should say. And even there, in terms of running the football, I think Ole Miss's numbers are a little unusually low because Quinshon Judkins wasn't healthy to start the year. They didn't have much of a good run game early on, like when they only scored 10 points against Alabama. The run game was still very much trying to get back on track. That has come back into its own really in recent weeks. They're a much more balanced football team, and that has made them a lot more dangerous. So, we talked about our, 1 through 133 power ratings. And you can go again to collegefootballnerds.com and just look at that. And we just do it by modeling every team against every other team in the country. Georgia's 4th, 122 and 10 essentially would be their record if they played everyone else. Does not mean 10 teams are picked to beat Georgia. That means they would lose 10 games if they played 132. And then Ole Miss is 108th and 24th. That's a big difference, but it's not that big of a difference. Ole Miss is still a top 15 team, right behind Tennessee. This is a big gauntlet for Georgia. Missouri, for what it's worth, just a little bit further back. They're 20th in our metric rather than 15th. And it's 103 wins projected versus 108 in this, right? So I think it's fair to say that this is just a harder test than Missouri was. But, and this is to me the big difference, the way that Missouri is built as a football team and how they get their results is very different. Because Missouri is built around Brady Cook's ability to deliver the football, that I think is one of the more underrated passers, at least versus certain schemes. Teams that try to run man coverage versus him have repeatedly failed. This is now twice in a row where Missouri has faced a team that went to a heavy zone look in the second half. LSU did it, who's a terrible defense, as we're now painfully aware, and now Georgia did it and completely shut him down. And Luther Burden is their everything receiver, but he's also a big possession guy, very, very physical, not necessarily super explosive. Ole Miss doesn't really have a Luther Burden, but what they've got is a lot of guys that are really good. They're a much more balanced, spread out attack. I think they're capable of attacking different coverages. And so I think it's a little different in that Missouri's maybe a little more of a one-trick pony in certain ways, and Ole Miss is a much more balanced, all-around, complete offense.
So we've seen Georgia this year give up some yards to, I don't want to say mobile quarterbacks, but quarterbacks that can run if they have to. And Ole Miss scores 38 against A&M Saturday without Dart running much at all. And I think they even mentioned in the broadcast that Lane Kiffin had said that they want to get Jaxon Dart more involved in the run game. Is that the path for Ole Miss to put up, before we get into this, Josh, just real quick, how many points do you think, we're not making a prediction yet, how many points do you think Ole Miss needs to win this game?
Minimum 30.
Minimum 30. Okay, so how much, let's assume all the running backs are healthy. Do you think Jaxon Dart has to hit a certain number of maybe design carries or positive yards carries, saying take the sacks off the table, for them to hit that 30? Is he going to have to be involved in the game as a runner at all, or not?
I think he probably does. I think he's probably going to hit something like 50 yards rushing. And to that point, our model, when we first released it that week, now there was a bug for the first couple days. It had Auburn winning by a point. We fixed that, and then it had Georgia winning by a few points over Auburn. But it flagged that Georgia's run defense hadn't really been great. Been good, but not great against a lot of the teams they played relative to how good they were. And I think that's sort of held up, but it's held up in a very specific way. Georgia's run defense is really good between the tackles. Like tackle to tackle, they're good. The defensive linemen are big, they're physical, 2 gap linemen. Outside the tackles, they don't quite have the containability and the range that some of those prior defenses have. And people have had a lot of success working them on the edges. In terms of metrics, they're 35th in our run defense metrics. Again, solid, but just solid. Third against the pass, by the way, but 35th against the run. The thing with the quarterback running the ball is it really allows you to stress those edges, because you can run with a tailback all you want, but he's still got to come in and bounce it outside, or it's going to be obvious in a pitch play. With quarterbacks, because you can run zone read concepts, and you can, even if it's designed, you can hold those inside linebackers. Like DeMoss Johnson's a really good player, but you can hold him with the running back inside, and then you can make Chambliss and the other guys chase the quarterback on the edge, which is what Auburn did, and have a lot of success. So to the extent that Georgia is vulnerable, I don't think they're 35% overall vulnerable. I think they're really good between the tackles and probably, frankly, a little deficient outside of the tackles. And that's panned out the way they've played different teams like Kentucky that couldn't run the ball at all because they have no ability to run the ball with a quarterback. So I do think Jaxon Dart has to run. I know there's a longer answer than probably you asked for. But again, we try to use data rather than just throwing out hot takes. And I do think there's actual hard data that backs up this point.
Georgia's a little banged up coming into this game. So DeMoss Johnson might actually, I think, is out indefinitely. People have said that Brock Bowers is already running in practice. After a tightrope, there's no way he's playing in this game. I don't think he's playing until
with a sprained
playoffs.
ankle, you can run in a straight line pretty quickly, and that's part of rehab. That's a very different thing than playing in a football game.
Yeah, and the tightrope surgeries, the more popular ones we've seen some on some offensive linemen that have gotten back pretty quickly, and then the one that I remember is Tua. I think he had 2, but he had a tightrope where he was hurt in like the middle of the season, and then 3 games later he was playing against LSU after a tightrope. But they weren't running him much in practice. He was running just in straight lines. He wasn't doing cuts. He certainly wasn't like blocking. And he was very ginger after every series. I think Bowers will be back this year, but I don't think it's going to be for this game, and I actually don't think it's going to be for regular season plus SEC championship. Having said all that, Bowers' understudy looked great Saturday. I think the system is the system. Offensively, it's an efficiency monster. And in terms of how, we've got a lot of experience talking about Pete Golding when he was at Alabama, and we've seen Ole Miss's defense this year. I do think it's improved, but 35 to A&M's not great. Although I do think that Johnson can get rolling a little bit, and people don't give him as much credit as he deserves, and it's a talented team. But in your mind, is Ole Miss better suited to stop a very vertical, explosive offense, or an efficiency monster like Georgia has had and is starting to show that they have this year too?
Sorry, my wife sent me a link to a horse-shaped shark toy. And I'm not going to tell her that I said this live, and now she can find when she watches the video. That was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen in my life. I think the problem with Ole Miss really is that they struggle the most with teams that have the ability to impose their will due to either real advantages in speed or physicality. They're a well-coached defense under Golding. They've been pretty dynamic in what they've done. Golding tends to be, I think, overly multiple, meaning that they try to use players as variable players in flex positions to maybe an unusually high degree. And where that really bit Alabama under Golding, and I've seen it now a couple times at Ole Miss, is when teams have the ability to run the ball successfully, in the personnel groupings they tend to find themselves in, they start to cave, and they start to overcompensate with numbers to fix that problem, and then they've overcompensated, and the defensive schemes don't work from a pass defense standpoint. The LSU game last year, right, where they got one defensive lineman on the field is the classic example. But I think in general, a lot of times they ask outside linebackers to cover backs and things, and they can just get really strained. LSU really torched that Ole Miss defense because people talk about the passing game, but they got absolutely run over in that football game. I mean, to me, the defining characteristic of why LSU got the 49 points is they had Logan Diggs at 101 yards rushing. They had Jaden Daniels had 99 yards rushing. Emory had 23 yards rushing. It's over 200 yards rushing. So he threw for 414 yards. But if they weren't running the ball for over 5 yards a carry and didn't run for 3 touchdowns, I don't think that happens. And so while the athleticism advantages played a part in LSU, it was the balance that mattered. Georgia is more balanced than they get credit for. I think Carson Beck has been a much better quarterback than he got credit for. In fact, let me ask you this question. Okay, so I think both of us are of the same opinion that Jaden Daniels has been the best quarterback in the SEC. I think probably the best in the country, frankly. After him, I mean, how far back would you put Beck? Like, I don't know if I'd put Cook ahead of him or not. Like, I'm not sure that I put anybody ahead of Beck. And people, I'm sure there's going to be Alabama fans screaming for Milroe, but I'm not sure that's justified.
No, and I think that you have to contextualize it with how effective they are within the system that they play. Could you drop Beck into Washington's offense and he be as good in that system as Penix Jr.? I don't think so. But Georgia, and we said this, for years as the original founding members of the Stetson Bennett fan club, and I see a lot of it now as well in terms of quick decision-making, ruthlessly efficient. And, Daniels is my number one Heisman pick by a mile right now. But in terms of deadly effectiveness in their offense, Beck is definitely top 5.
Yeah, and that to me is really the deciding point. The fact that Georgia does have the ability to run and throw effectively. And people have already forgotten the fact that when Georgia was struggling a little more offensively to begin the year, they didn't have healthy tailbacks. They do have healthy tailbacks now. That offense is a lot more balanced than it was early in the season. And so I do think it starts to create a situation where if you're Ole Miss, you're going to struggle a little bit because Georgia's able to do two things well. And if you can't stop one or the other, then your defense is going to be kind of out of sorts and things can start to steamball on you pretty quickly.
So why don't we get into what the model thinks? I'll set it up with just kind of where Vegas is looking at this game right now. So Georgia's a 10.5-point favorite. And I'm going to pull up really quickly because we have all the lines on collegefootballrunners.com. 58-50, 58.5 over under. 10.5-point favorite. Let's talk about what the model says, but I want to remind everybody, other than the Kentucky game, which we called out before the game was played, the model has been absolutely nails on Georgia this year. I think they had Georgia winning by 7, 6.5 or 7 versus Missouri last week. They had them blowing out Florida 39-13. They had a 3-point win over Auburn. So it's been really good with Georgia. For whatever reason, it's had them pretty well pegged. So let's talk about what it says about this game.
And it's eerily in line with Vegas, right? 34.4 to 23.3 is its projection. So that's an 11-point game and a total here of 57.7, right? So if your line is 10.5 and 58 over under, it's right there. It's basically saying that the Vegas projections are pretty much a completely neutral projection for where these two teams are. When you break down the underlying metrics, it's 6.3 yards per play for Georgia, 5.4 yards per play for Ole Miss, 8.5 yards per attempt of 7.3, 4 yards per attempt to about 3.8. And where I think is kind of interesting is where the advantages lie. Offensively, when Georgia has the ball, they have about a 10% advantage when throwing it. They have about a 6% disadvantage when running it. When Ole Miss has the ball, they have a 4% advantage when running it and a 6% disadvantage when throwing it. So both these teams really don't have a significant edge on either side. They're both at within about 10% versus each other. When you look at all these performance metrics, one relative to the other, it just comes down to the fact that I think Georgia's just a more efficient football team in general. I mean, that's what you're seeing from the score differential, and even the yardage differential to a certain extent. It's also reflecting the fact that Georgia is more pass heavy than Ole Miss, which I think everyone always forgets that Lane Kiffin's offenses have been predominantly run based. They tend to run more on third down than most anyone else. And the trick is that passing the ball is generally more effective than running it. So if you can pass it more than you run and do it successfully, your offense is going to be a little bit more effective. And Georgia is actually the more pass-happy team in this game than Ole Miss. It reminds me of last year, I think the Tennessee game, we called that out, right? That everybody thought of Tennessee as being the explosive passing team, but Georgia actually had a much higher pass rate than Tennessee did. This is a very similar deal. And so because of all those things, the scoring efficiency stuff, the fact that Georgia skews more pass than run, even with really fairly similar per play production, a little bit in Georgia's edge, it creeps that much more to Georgia's side, which is why this becomes more of a 10, 11 point lead, at least in the model's eyes, for Georgia.
Let me put a question to you that I think is a very interesting talking point that nobody's touched on this year. So when you looked at Georgia's schedule at the beginning of the year, everybody said Georgia's schedule is trash, right? Now, turns out, and Missouri and Ole Miss are not going to get the brand name credentials that they deserve, but like Georgia played Missouri, they were 12th in the nation in November, right? Ole Miss is a top 10 team in November. So this is not like you were 10 in week 2, but you ended up going 4-8. These are teams who won a boatload of games throughout the year, and come November, they're right around 10th in the country. This is, for all of the complaints about Georgia's schedule, they're going to play 3 ranked teams in a row. They're going to play 2 back-to-back borderline top 10 teams in a row. And that's where my question is on this. What do you think the chances are that Ole Miss comes out and potentially has a day, especially offensively, because Georgia didn't have the luxury of spreading these 2 teams out throughout the year? They played them back-to-back, so Georgia couldn't do extra prep work for Ole Miss, which makes this actually a hard, backloaded schedule. What are the odds that Ole Miss comes in, or would it shock you if they come in and put Georgia on their heels a little bit just because Georgia didn't get the luxury of doing a lot of prep work because they had a tough game last week?
It's not shocking. It's the obvious answer to it, right? I mean, the reality is that it's hard to play ranked teams in a row. In this gauntlet at the end of the year, for what had been presumed to be a pretty easy schedule for Georgia, is actually quite difficult. These are 3 top 15, top 20 teams in Missouri, Ole Miss, and Tennessee, all coming in a row. Their arch rivals in Alabama end up in a situation where Kentucky, they play LSU, then they play Kentucky, which is kind of tough, but they're sandwiched between games that aren't necessarily so hard, and Auburn ends up being really down. Georgia's schedule is more difficult than was anticipated. Now, there's something to be said, too, that Ole Miss is coming off a really tough game against Texas A&M, and people will scoff at Texas A&M. They are the classic team that has lost, 3 of their 4 games by a touchdown or less against very high-level competition. They can't win. They deserve their ranking. They deserve everything that comes with a ranking. But at the same time, they're a tough team to beat, so you have to be prepared. I don't think Ole Miss is going to have a lot of time for extra advantages as a result of that. It's also at Georgia, so it's not like you're playing in really foreign, hostile territory when you play Ole Miss in this game. But I do think what's notable in sometimes these cross-divisional games is that Georgia is going to face a kind of opponent they're not used to. Kiffin throws a lot of wrinkles at teams. He knows how to exploit teams' defensive tendencies and matchups. It's important to remember Kiffin's a guy that coached with Kirby Smart at Georgia. And when Kiffin first came to Ole Miss, he gave Nick Saban fits because he used to run that offense against the Nick Saban defense year in and year out. But, that Nick Saban defense was really the Kirby Smart defense. And I think people forget that. So I do think he's going to throw some things at Georgia that's going to make them really uncomfortable. And he's going to really do a good job probably of getting that Georgia defense out of sorts. So it won't shock me if this is a fourth quarter game. It won't shock me if this is a game Ole Miss can win. 10 points is a pretty big margin, but it's like an 80% chance to win, right? I mean, Vegas is still saying there's a 1 in 5 or greater chance that Ole Miss wins this game. And even then, I think, there's a lot to be said that this is an opponent Georgia's not used to playing. And I think one of these teams may jump on the other, but it's a pretty fun, exciting matchup and something I'm excited to see just from the perspective of you don't see these teams play each other enough. You don't see Georgia play LSU and Ole Miss in the regular season enough with their offenses, at least in recent years. So it's a really fun matchup.
All right, so I'm ready to give my pick on this one. I don't think Georgia covers this game. I didn't think they covered. Didn't think they would cover last week. I picked them to win by 7, and without the late pick 6 or what. I think that's how they went up by 10. That game was super tight. I still think Georgia's one of the best teams in the country. I just think Ole Miss is actually really good, and it's a tough sandwich game for Georgia because I got Tennessee next week too. The other thing that's worth noting, Josh, about these back-to-back tough games for Georgia, including Alabama if they play in the conference championship game, they're all wildly different matchup situations, wildly different schematically. Give me Georgia 31, Ole Miss 24, a little less comfortable game than they'd like between the hedges, but they still win.
Yeah, I'm going to take it 31-27, so we're really the same differential we were in our prior video with Michigan and Penn State. I'm with you. I think this is a game that's going to make Georgia very uncomfortable. I think if Georgia covers, the cover is likely to come in a backdoor cover. There's still a big part of me that wonders if Georgia is going to be able to establish their physicality and push Ole Miss around, because I think it's possible that maybe Ole Miss just can't handle Georgia. It's a little difficult to project that because in a weird way this year between the SEC East and the West, they've been a little too isolated, in part because things like Georgia hasn't played Tennessee. So Tennessee's played some SEC West teams, A&M and Alabama, and that's kind of shown us how those relate. But Tennessee hasn't played enough of the other good teams in the East, including Georgia, for me to know what that means as it comes to Georgia. So I'm not really sure how it's going to translate in that regard. But I just don't necessarily think Georgia is going to be able to push them around enough of an extent to run them over one, but especially defensively to completely stop them. And I think it's going to be a very uncomfortable game and one that Georgia very easily could lose. Personally setting the spread, I would actually have set it lower. I would have set it about 7.5. So my projection's actually lower than my spread. Maybe that's philosophically wrong, but that's just sort of where I'm at in this ballgame.
Josh, people are going to immediately go to transitive property and say Alabama beat them 24-10, beat Ole Miss 24-10. So y'all think Alabama's better or whatever? I think it's just matchups. I think it's matchups, sequencing, where it happens in the year, all of that. Like that Ole Miss game for Alabama was the first time that they looked like a functional football team. So I don't think that there's any transitive property here if this game plays out the way we do. In your mind, let's say Georgia wins 31-27 at home versus Ole Miss. Would you still have them as a favorite over Alabama at this point?
Maybe, but about dead even, honestly. And that,
okay.
Look, all three of the teams in question here, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Alabama, are not the same team they were at the point where Alabama played Ole Miss, is the biggest thing I'll say. Ole Miss had a really bad day in a lot of ways offensively. They had a lot of stalled fourth down conversions and things that kept points off the board. Alabama offensively kind of looked like a different ball club entirely. They didn't know what to do with Jalen Milroe at that point, and they were kind of a hodgepodge of concepts. The reality is that Alabama has really figured out their offense to a tremendous degree from that day. But Ole Miss has gotten much more balanced than they were. The run game was not really on track yet. They are a much more balanced offensive football team. The defense has gotten better. Georgia is a much just all-around better football team, but also no longer has Brock Bowers, who was early to mid-season, he was the guy that got every time they needed a first down or a big play, he's the guy they turned to. I mean, he was the hand the key, get a first down guy. And I know they did pretty well against Missouri without him, and I know they had, they had a lot of success, as you said, with Minnie Bowers, the understudy. But I don't necessarily know that you can turn around and expect that production to pan out long term, right? Like I think, I do think there's a reality here where, Delp and everything else in that Georgia offense at some point is going to show the lack of Brock Bowers, that they're going to have a little bit more of a struggle to make these big and positive plays. And Lovett and Rosemy Jackson and McConkey and Thomas are all good receivers. They're good receivers. I don't know that any of them is a major game-breaking receiver, and Bowers was. And so, until they get Bowers back, they're going to be a little bit more hamstrung. Whereas a lot of these other teams have improved from where they were early in the season. So, like you said, it's matchups and also sequencing and timing, I think, for where Georgia's at right now, that could prove this to be a pretty dangerous football game.
Okay, this is another one that I love to do because I think you find it slightly annoying. Let's include Alabama in there. Let's say they've got, and I did leave Tech out, but I also did a tweet just down and left Tech out. But they've got Ole Miss, Tennessee, Tech, Alabama, those 4 games, 4 in a row, no bye weeks. If you're given odds on Georgia dropping one of these games, any one of these games, is it above 50%? And not in the way of like each game you have 70% chance of winning. That means, but just if you were picking yes or no, is Georgia going to lose one of these games, and you had to pick one, what would you pick? Well,
so you sort of have 2 different questions here, right? Like which game is the most likely one to drop, and what?
No, not just taking all of them, like undefeated or not. What are you going yes or no?
Honestly, probably no. Between Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Alabama, the odds of you dropping one of the 3 are probably going to be higher than 50% as they stand right now. It's hard to go through 3 games like that and not drop one. Would they be favored over all 3? Probably. Alabama, I still think is a tough question, but the Alabama game in particular is getting really close to a 50-50 proposition. And as soon as that happens, I mean, you need to be 90% likely to beat Ole Miss and Tennessee to be expected to win out. Expected to. And I don't know if they're there. So I'm not sure that I would say they're more than 50% likely to win out at this point. I think that number has fallen probably below 50% when you include the conference championship game. And I'm looking at it right now. Their projected win-loss on FPI, which includes the conference championship game, always super confusing, includes it to the extent that you're likely to be there. So you'll end up with like 12 and a half total games played. But for Georgia's case, it's already locked in. Their record projected is 11.6 to 1.3. So FBI, which is a pretty good win-loss projector, actually predicts Georgia to lose a game and a half, or 1.3 out of those 3 games. So they give them just greater than 50% odds, average odds of winning each one of them. The odds of winning all 3 are actually pretty low. And in fact, they have a win-out percentage, and their win-out percentage for Georgia is only 18%. So to the extent that I said that and it sounds crazy, I'm actually more bullish than like FPI is, that has a particular metric on this point. And I know our metrics would probably be pretty similar if I ran my model and did the same thing. So it's not a crazy stance to take by any means.
And this is why I hate the preseason narratives. And look, we were part of this. Like, we didn't love Georgia's schedule, but most of it was lamenting the loss of the Oklahoma game and defending Oklahoma and Georgia for dropping that game. Neither one of them wanted to drop that game. I've said it 1,000 times. But I hate that the narrative has been pressed this entire season that Georgia and Michigan don't play anybody, when in reality, the Penn State game this weekend, that team is not as good as the team Georgia beat last weekend, and that's the third best team that Georgia will play in their last 4 games. To me, it's frustrating that now Georgia can't lose a game because their schedule is so weak, when it turns out that Georgia's going to have one of the tougher schedules of all the contenders in the playoffs to make the playoffs. And by the way, almost all of their hard games were all in a row. So I hate the narrative. I'm sorry that I was a part of it at the beginning of the season. I don't think if Georgia loses one of these games, they should be automatically rejected on the basis of them having a quote-unquote weak schedule. And I just think that people haven't realized that Ole Miss, Missouri are really good teams this year. And by the way, Georgia Tech isn't terrible.
Yeah, and again, you get Tennessee thrown in there too, who's been Tennessee's biggest issue is they're mercurial, and you never know what you're going to get out of Joe Milton, because he can, when he's on, which was a segment of like the Alabama game, we saw it some in the Tennessee game, the dude has a cannon, and when he's on and the intermediate passing game is going, it's almost undefendable because of how much velocity he gets on the ball. And then there's other periods where the receivers can't catch and they can't hit the broadside of the barn. So that's another very dangerous game for Georgia, which we might, again, because they're all in a row, we're going to end up covering. We didn't cover Georgia much beginning of the year. People griped. We're going to cover them a bunch probably the end of the year, maybe even next week. It's another dangerous game, so I totally agree with you.
All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think about, 1, the score in this game, and 2, about Georgia's schedule down the stretch. Has our commentary maybe changed your mind on whether or not you think that their schedule is a little better than you might have thought 2 weeks ago? Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.